Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Institute for Government. I'm Jill Rutter. I'm a programme director here in charge of our work on better policy making, and we're absolutely delighted to be able to organise this event today in conjunction with the Centre for Global Development, open brackets, Europe, close brackets. We've got an excellent panel, as you know. We've got Sir Tim Lankester, former Treasurer colleague of mine. He was in the Treasury until the end of 1988, at which point, having battled on Pergau from the Treasury, he then moved across to be the Permanent Secretary of the Overseas Development Administration, then, as he'll tell you, part of the Foreign Office. We also have another former Treasury colleague, it's getting a bit of a theme, Owen Barder. He left the Treasury quite some time ago, and in his most recent incarnation is the Director of the Centre for Global Development Europe. And we are going to be joined by Simon Jenkins, who all of you know was then a columnist, distinguished journalist, and is still a columnist and distinguished journalist. What's going to happen is Tim is going to talk for about 20-25 minutes, give you the outlines of what he has in his book, which I have to say, having read it over the weekend, is extremely highly recommended. But do listen, because the book is also quite exceptionally highly priced. So since this really is one of the themes, is value for money, I think listening carefully to Tim is clearly the value for money option tonight. We'll then, if he's arrived, and Simon has actually already seen what Tim is saying, so he won't be flying completely blind, we'll get Simon to comment on some of the politics and how it seemed at the time, and how it seems actually 20 years on, and then Owen to talk about what it meant for aid. And I might throw in the odd reflection, because I realised when I was reading Tim's book, feeling rather bad, that actually I was a bit part player, because I was in the Chief Secretary's office in 1988, when the Chief Secretary failed to rise to Tim's advice to go in and bat against the combined forces, Mrs. Thatcher, the Defence Secretary, Charles Powell. If he had, history might have been very different, of course. But anyway, so without further ado, I'm going to pass on to Sir Tim Lankester.
Thank you very much. Well, Jill, thank you very much, and Owen, thank you very much indeed for hosting this event. It's extremely kind of you, and I'm delighted to see so many old friends and family and former colleagues from ODA and the Treasury here tonight. Thanks so much for coming. Now, Pergau was the most controversial episode in the 50-year history of British aid. And I felt it was time for a critical account of what happened and why. Because I was deeply involved in it, I had my own memories, but I needed to fill a lot of gaps. By allowing me access to all of DFID's files on Pergau, Permanent Secretary Mark Lowcock, who I think may be here tonight, has enabled me to do this. Thanks very much to Mark. I had no such luck with DESO, the Defence Export Service Organisation, the government body responsible for helping our arms exporters. It was, in those days, part of MOD. It's now part of the Department of Business Innovation and Skills. DESO seemed determined to maintain a veil over their role in this sorry saga. And some of the papers which I know exist turned out to have gone missing from their files. So much for freedom of information. The Pergau Dam lies high up amidst forested mountains on the Malay-Thai border. The setting is really beautiful. When I visited last year, there was a gentle mist coming down over the lake. There were fresh elephant footprints around the perimeter. A mile below the dam is an underground power station, and for 3 hours a day, water pours down a concrete tunnel to drive 4 massive turbines. The power from these turbines and associated generators helps to meet peaking demand in Kuala Lumpur, hundreds of miles to the south. It all appears very impressive and very normal. It is impressive, and the plant works really well. But its funding from the aid budget back in 1991 was far from normal. This project was hugely uneconomic, and the funding was linked to a major arms deal. My book is a story of corporate interests in Britain and personal and party political interests in Malaysia, trumping sound economics and sensible development. It's the story of a dominant prime minister playing the role of super saleswoman and riding roughshod over her colleagues, It's the story of an even more dominant Prime Minister in Malaysia, Mohammed Mahathir, insisting on aid to lubricate an arms deal and intent on a hydro scheme that his country's national power company didn't want and didn't need for another 10 years. It's a story of conflicting policy agendas in Whitehall and the inability of a professionally strong but politically weak aid ministry to defend its corner. And as happens in government, it's a story of mishap and muddle. Lack of transparency made it impossible for Parliament and the media and the development NGOs to provide any serious challenge. When the facts started to emerge in 1993, 2 years later, they caused a political storm. They tarnished, in my view unjustly, the reputation of a distinguished foreign secretary. They undermined the standing of Britain's aid programme. They caused a rupture in our relations with Malaysia and ended up with the funding being declared unlawful in the High Court. Quite a mixture. The story starts in March 1988, when George Younger, Secretary of State for Defence, visits Malaysia to promote British defence exports. This was his job. He signs a secret protocol which promises £200 million in aid for civil projects in return for Malaysia purchasing £1 billion worth of defence equipment. Now, the promise of aid in return for arms sales was totally against long-standing British policy. It was against OECD rules, to which Britain was a signatory, and it implied a substantial raid on an aid budget that over the previous 8 years had been cut in half. Younger was a cautious minister. I knew him, and he'd been specifically warned by the Treasury before he left London not to offer any financial sweeteners. He later explained that without the aid offer, there wouldn't have been a deal, and he hadn't had time to consult London. It's more likely that his advisors from DESO told him that he should go ahead and sign regardless. The head of DESO at that time was Colin Chandler, on secondment from and his salary paid by British Aerospace. He later went on to be CEO and chairman of Vickers. He was with Younger in Kuala Lumpur. Chandler had little time for the niceties of Whitehall consultation and collective responsibility. An underbriefed British High Commissioner offered no resistance. The Foreign Secretary in 1988 was Geoffrey Howe. He had overarching responsibility for the aid budget. Chris Patton was the minister in charge of ODA, reporting to Howe. When they heard of the signing a few days later, they were absolutely furious. Howe called in Younger on return and demanded that he retract the protocol or find the money from his own budget. Younger said that if the money didn't come from the aid budget, the arms deal was off. Mrs. Thatcher entered the fray and insisted that Younger's promise of aid would have to be honoured. The FCO were told to sort it out. The solution they came up with was to tell the Malaysians that there could be no linking of aid to arms sales, and separately to tell them that £200 million worth of aid was available. In 1988, I was number 2 in the Treasury's overseas group. I advised John Major, who was then in charge of public spending, that no one would be taken in by this. It would be far better for the arms deal to collapse than for the de facto linkage to be maintained. I had a premonition that government was heading for a train crash. But it was wishful thinking on my part that Major would step in and do anything. He'd only been in the cabinet 9 months, and he was not about to take on Mrs. Thatcher on something so dear to her heart. On June 28, 1988, one letter was dispatched to the Malaysian government denying the possibility of any linkage between our aid and arms. On that very same day, another letter was dispatched offering £200 million in aid. For the next 5 years, ministers went into denial. It was a perfect example of what the American psychologist Danny Kahneman has called the illusion of validity. Ministers repeatedly claimed that there was no link. Technically, the link had been broken, but there is copious documentary evidence that I've seen that in the minds of the principal players in Malaysia and in Britain, the linkage remained in place. The Financial Times journalist Joe Regaley later described the denial of any linkage as convincing as a bigamist protesting that his two marriages are separately enjoyed. Good old Joe. After promising aid on such an irregular basis, you'd have thought that the government, on a basis that they hoped to keep under wraps, you'd have thought that the government would have taken the greatest possible care to ensure that any projects to be financed in Malaysia would satisfy ODA's minimum standards of viability. Not a bit of it. Through many twists and turns, which I go over in my book, ODA was prevailed upon to fund a hydroelectric scheme that its economists and engineers, and it's great to see them here tonight, as well as their counterparts in the Malaysian National Power Company. It was a project that they deemed hopelessly uneconomic. Both the Malaysian side and our own economists and engineers reckoned that the amount of energy that Pergau would generate over its lifetime would be £100 million more costly than gas turbine plant of the same capacity using Malaysia's plentiful offshore gas supplies. Unfortunately, neither Chris Patten nor his successor Linda Chalker felt able to put up a serious challenge. Because remember, under the Thatcher and Major governments, the aid minister was not a member of the cabinet. And at official level, ODA did let things slip. I arrived at ODA in 1999, and already Mrs. Thatcher had made a provisional aid offer for Pergau to Dr. Mahathir in person at 10 Downing Street. Soon after making the offer, the cost estimates jumped by a third. Yet we didn't try, we didn't dare take the aid offer off the table. We vainly hoped that with the costs rising, the Malaysians would back off and the proposal would somehow go away. But we hadn't reckoned on Dr. Mahathir's determination to build Pergau at more or less any cost, provided he could get the aid, nor the determination and guile of the contractors and their cheerleaders in Whitehall. The key lobbyist on the British side was a former DTI civil servant, John Lippitt, who was GEC's international director. GEC, Britain's largest private company at the time, had a major interest in the defence deal and in Pergau. On the Malaysian side, the key figure was Tan Sri Arumugam. He was GEC's top man in Malaysia and principal advisor to Dr. Mahathir on defence procurement, a conflict of interest not untypical in Mahathir's Malaysia. Lippitt and Arumugam both had ready access to Mrs. Thatcher's foreign policy private secretary, Charles Powell. They made a formidable duo. For ODA, it felt more like a trio. Crunch time came in early 1991 when the government had finally to decide whether or not to confirm the aid. John Major was now Prime Minister and Douglas Hurd was Foreign Secretary. Both knew Pergau was an unsatisfactory project, but they had to balance this against the political and commercial damage which would ensue if the aid was now denied. In ODA, it was perfectly obvious that we had to advise against. But in what terms? As ODA's accounting officer, it seemed to me that the economics of the project were so unequivocally bad that the expenditure could not possibly be said to meet the standard test for all public spending, that is to say, economy, efficiency, and effectiveness. Just to remind you, if you've not worked in Whitehall, if expenditure fails to meet this test, accounting officers may insist on a written instruction from their minister, and in this way they are formally disassociated from the spending. Ministers have to take the full responsibility for it. I decided I had to warn ministers that I would require a written instruction, partly to demonstrate that we thought this was a monstrously bad use of the aid budget, partly also to protect my back if the decision was eventually picked over by the Public Accounts Committee, which I was sure it would be. It was my unusual request for a written instruction, very unusual in those days, that catapulted Pergau into the newspaper headlines when the National Audit Office produced a report in 1993. But as accounting officer, I also had to decide whether the aid was within the law, whether it was, in the words of ODA's enabling legislation, I quote, for the purpose of promoting development. I had my doubts. If the aid was going to be used in such a suboptimal way, how could it be assisting Malaysia's development? Fast forward to 1994, when the Pergau decision was challenged in the High Court by the World Development Movement. Lord Justice Rose, presiding, asked precisely the same question, and he answered in the negative when he delivered his landmark ruling that the aid was unlawful. But the advice I received within ODA back in 1991 was that the aid for Pergau would be lawful. It was adding to Malaysia's power-generating capacity, and the Secretary of State could therefore reasonably assert that the aid was assisting Malaysia's development if he really believed it. As it happens, some leading experts, from Derry Irvine before he became Lord Chancellor to Jonathan Sumption last year, just before he became a Supreme Court judge, argued that the judge got it wrong. They decried the court taking a view on what was and was not development. That was for Parliament or the Secretary of State, not for the courts. The judgment and even the court's decision to allow WDM to appeal was a surprise to many lawyers, including the government's own legal advisors. Nonetheless, there's no doubt with hindsight that I should have taken formal legal advice. Even if the advice had been, as it may well have been, that the aid was within the law, by not asking for formal legal advice, we exposed Lord Hurd to an even greater criticism later. This was not the only gap in the advice that went to him. Astonishing as it may seem, no one advised him of the risks emanating from George Younger's secret protocol. I assumed that he must have known about it. I assumed that the FCO would have advised him, because it was they who'd cobbled together the notional delinking. And it was a subject which ODA had pretty much been told to keep off. It turned out, and I can vouch for this because I've read the post-mortem carried out by the FCO, that Lord Hurd was never briefed on it before he approved the aid in 1991. I think the FCO really believed the linkage problem was dead and buried. I've often wondered if Lord Hurd would have reached a different decision if he'd known about the aid-arms linkage and the possibility of a legal challenge. As it was, the consideration which prevailed in his mind was the need to honour Mrs. Thatcher's word and not jeopardise Britain's relations with Malaysia, and that is why he approved the aid. John Major, who did know about the linkage and the notional delinking from his time at the Treasury, evidently agreed with him. They had strong support from the MOD. George Younger had retired from frontline politics. Alan Clark, more famous for his diaries than his political judgment, was now MOD's lead minister on Malaysia. Clark had no time for overseas aid. If there had to be an aid budget at all, he wanted it to be used to sell arms. The Treasury came in strongly behind ODA. Chief Secretary David Mellor, who we hear almost daily, pointed out that Mrs. Thatcher's original offer on Pergau was to be inflated by 50%. So why was it necessary to honour her word? But to no avail. Anyway, the aid was approved. An interest subsidy of £234 million, I think the largest aid commitment ODA ever made, or maybe DFID as well, since then. Construction of the dam and power station got underway, and for the next 2 years everything went pretty smoothly. Then in late 1993, the NAO published a very critical report, and questions immediately began to be asked. How could such a patently uneconomic project have been given the go-ahead? I was called to give evidence before the PAC. The committee commended me for insisting on a written instruction, but they gave me a rough time on many other aspects of ODA's handling. They ignored the political power play that had discouraged ODA from being more robust. I refused to answer questions on the arms linkage, which I reckon was for ministers to explain. The Foreign Affairs Committee also held hearings. They concluded that the government had had to approve the aid after the promises that had been made. But they had severe criticism for the way in which ministers had got themselves into such a mess, especially the secret protocol and Mrs. Thatcher's premature aid offer on an intentionally misleading cost estimate from the contractors. Rumours of bribery in connection with Pergau had been swirling around for a while. Malaysian ministers had a reputation for accepting backhanders. The Labour spokesperson on aid, Anne Clwyd, wrote to the Controller and Auditor General and asked him to investigate. The CNAG looked to us for advice. We were unable to find any hard evidence, although our ability to investigate was really limited to trawling over the cost estimates of the contract, the cost breakdown of the contract, to make sure that the aid funds were not being misused in this way. Then in February 1994, the Sunday Times published allegations of bribery which so infuriated Dr. Mathieu that he decreed a ban on all new public sector contracts with British firms. It lasted for 7 months. Douglas Hurd later wrote in his memoirs, "I was defending a wasteful project on grounds of good faith and friendship with a man who was busy kicking us in the teeth." 2 highly critical select committee reports, 3 debates in Parliament, the trade ban, and finally the adverse judgment in the High Court created a perfect storm for the major government, all from a mistaken arms deal and the inability of ODA to stand its ground and insist on its minimum standards for project approval. I've looked carefully at ODA's original appraisal of Pergau to see whether, in the light of the knowledge available at the time, the methodology and conclusions were correct. I had nothing to do with the original appraisal because, as Permanent Secretary, I pretty much took it on trust. So I was able to look at it through entirely fresh eyes. I concluded that the ODA economists and engineers did a great job, and in spite of the efforts of the contractors and their Whitehall backers to stand in their way. I think Alan Whitworth's here tonight. Alan, good to see you. One of the, and Dick Jones is here tonight. Good, you're the good guys. Nobody else was really good. Well done. I also looked at the economics of Pergau in the light of what we know now. I took into account 2 significant developments that were unforeseen in 1991. The first was the need to put a notional cost on the carbon emissions if the electricity from Pergau had been generated by gas turbines instead. The second was to insert somewhat higher prices for natural gas than originally assumed, because Malaysia's offshore gas peaked rather sooner than we had expected. My conclusion is that Pergau did turn out significantly less costly than originally estimated, that it was still the wrong investment by a considerable margin. The immediate effect of Pergau on the aid programme was disastrous. ODA's reputation was badly damaged and the aid budget suffered further cuts. Over the medium term, the consequences were beneficial. The Labour Party determined that nothing like this should ever happen again, and when it came to power in 1997, ODA was re-established as a separate ministry with a seat in the cabinet. The aid and trade provision through which Pergau and other commercially driven aid projects had been funded was abolished. Procurement was completely untied so that never again would British contractors have a monopoly when bidding for aid projects. And poverty alleviation became a much stronger focus. The Conservatives had learned some important lessons too, and they made no attempt to oppose Labour's changes. When they came back to power with the Lib Dems in 2010, they essentially continued with Labour's policies. Finally, what other lessons can be learned? First, checks and balances on the executive before it decided to fund Pergau worked poorly. This was because Parliament and the public were given so little information about the proposal, and because there was a cover-up on the arms deal. Greater transparency would have stopped the funding in its tracks. Secondly, the accountability arrangements after worked reasonably well. As a Canadian scholar of government later wrote, and I quote, "Responsibility for going against the established standards for financial management was squarely placed with ministers. The conduct of both officials and ministers was reviewed by parliamentary committees, and the electorate was allowed to make an informed judgment on the government's conduct of public business." Parliament could have known sooner about my request for a written instruction. I asked for the instruction in 1991. It only became public when the NAO published its report in 1993, 2.5 years later. In the light of Pergau, the government accepted the recommendation from the PAC that in future all such requests should be notified to the PAC immediately. If this had happened with Pergau, it's possible, although I think unlikely, that ministers would have pulled back at the last. The High Court judgment also sent a powerful message that the executive had to be more careful in relation to the law, not just with overseas aid, but in other areas of policy as well. All in all, for the ministers and officials involved, Pergau turned out to be a nightmare. And it didn't do anyone else any good, except the contractors for the project and the defence equipment exporters. It seemed to me a big enough episode in terms of recent political history and even more so in the history of British aid, to deserve a proper telling, and that's what I've tried to do in my book. Thank you.
So you'll have noticed that Simon Jenkins has now joined us on the panel and was actually here for most of Tim's speech. He's quoted on the back of the book saying, "A fascinating account of one of the shabbier episodes of the late Thatcher premiership, a case study in bad government, which should be read by anyone interested in the inner workings of Whitehall and Westminster." And it's also quoted in the book at the time, particularly at the time of the row with Malaysia, in what Tim describes as a blistering piece. Why should we give a damn? So Simon, why should we give a damn?
I completely forgot I wrote that. I do it too often. No, it's absolutely fascinating, Tim. I mean, I'm just reading a book by a man called Jonathan Haidt, an American political psychologist, and he pleads with everyone, whenever they're discussing political rows of any sort, not to overstate the rational, because the rational is just not very dominant. The whole of your story is the story of an attempt by the machine to justify basically a bad decision. The fact that it was a bad decision never played in that activity. The activity was entirely devoted to sanitizing, to laundering a really bad decision. And it was fascinating the way in which the way in which then and now it's discussed, and it's discussed by you in the book, is the assumption that these things are rational. Your major premise is these things ought to be done in an orderly way with the checks and balances falling into place, that public officials and ministers behave like honest citizens. The whole time they're trying to justify a bad decision when they should be trying to reverse the bad decision. The caliber of the people involved is dedicated, rather like Wolsey's clerks from Oxenford, to justify the man, not to reverse the decision and to reach the right decision. What I find fascinating about it is it's almost impossible to draw lessons from this, because it still happens today. If you look at the Saudi Arabian arms contracts under Tony Blair, exactly the same thing happened, in effect. I personally believe that there shouldn't be an international arms trade. It always leads to corruption. You're selling things people don't need to justify, to keep people in work in Britain. And they're doing the wrong thing, they're making weapons. When you start with a bad intention, you'll end up with a mess, which is what you've got here. On subsidiary points, I would be intrigued to know what you think about the role that greater transparency now might have in making it less likely to happen again. I'd ask that question with greater conviction if I thought it wasn't likely to happen again. But there's no doubt now that you do have a kind of a regular blizzard of FOI requests, demands for debates, public inquiries coming out of our ears. And that, one would like to think, might play some part in what is now, I think, a perfectly salutary culture in the British government, which is the U-turn. I mean, the ability actually to reverse a really bad decision rather than to plough on with it and demand everybody supports it. So I wonder if really you think now, I mean, you made references to how procedures change, but whether the wider culture has changed. The other thing is really whether you yourself put enough stress on the role that political personality plays in these relationships. It was very clear under Margaret Thatcher that people just didn't dare countermand her. I still don't think enough that happened under Thatcher has not been discussed in those terms. I mean, the extraordinary dominance of one person's personality over the entire culture of government, which wasn't true under Major, under Blair, or even now. And again, I wonder whether you gave enough stress to the chemistry of government rather than the process of government. The only last thing I make is that whenever I read these stories about British government, I do wonder how we dare comment on governments abroad. I mean, I don't think I read an article in a newspaper about an African or an Asian government without some British minister or official criticizing corruption. How dare we do it? And we still go on doing it. We seem completely oblivious to the beam in our own eye. There we are.
Thank you.
Tim, do you want to come back on any of those?
Well, very quickly. Greater transparency, well, Owen may be able to answer that. I'm absolutely certain that had the appraisal been available, I mean, it's extraordinary that the appraisal report that Alan Whitworth and Dick Jones and others wrote back in was not available to anybody. The contractors didn't see it, nobody saw it. Today, I understand it would be available. If people had seen that appraisal report and had seen that it was going to cost £100 million more to build a dam than use gas turbines using virtually free gas, it would never have happened. FOI, well, I used to be a bit against FOI when I had to defend my corner. I'm totally in favour now, because actually I spent 7 months trying to get stuff out of DISO and absolute blank wall in the end. So I don't know. I hope to think that greater transparency would stop this sort of thing happening. I suspect DFID is a more open organisation than many government ministries, but I don't know.
And Tim, I mean, you in an earlier incarnation were a private secretary to Mrs. Thatcher when she was newly appointed. Do you think that Simon's point about her extraordinary dominance, was that a sort of later Thatcher phenomenon?
Yeah, I think it was later. I was her private secretary, economic private secretary from 79 to 81. At that time, it was a very febrile cabinet. She wasn't dominant as she was much later. There were some ministers who she could kick around, but not all of them. I mean, she kicked around Jim Pryor in a big way, but there were others who, and David Howell, one or two others, but others she couldn't. I think it was a later phenomenon where her personal dominance prevailed.
Okay. Owen, I think Tim's book brings out that actually one of maybe the positive spin-offs, it says there are very few people who emerge better, but maybe the aid programme, aid, actually did emerge better as a result of Pergau being hauled through the courts and hauled through public scrutiny. So, from the CGD perspective.
Thanks, Jill, and thanks, Tim, for both a really interesting book and a very interesting speech, and for setting this on the record. I'm going to make 3 very quick points, because there's lots of experience and expertise in the room, people who will want to chip into the conversation. So, 3 quick points. One is not related to the aid, the effect on the aid programme, which was the effect on me as a civil servant. I was a young Treasury economist when this was happening, and here was you fighting with cost-benefit analysis and economic appraisals to tell to the government that the choices they were making were not the most effective use of public funds, and that they were not a good way to deliver their stated objectives. And I think you shouldn't underestimate how important that was for us young civil servants to see the value of the civil service speaking truth unto power. And it was certainly an inspiration for me, and I'm sure for many other people. You were the kind of civil servant we wanted to become. So thank you for that, and thank you, I think, on behalf of a whole generation of people, and on behalf of the civil service for the way you handled this. 2 points then about the aid programme. One is, I mean, it speaks for itself in your narrative. The damage that was done to the aid programme by linking aid to arms sales and indeed to contractors was so evident from this that, as you said, both in your book and in your speech, neither government felt able to continue with that. And this was partly a change, I think, in people's economic assumptions at the time. We'd moved away from fixed exchange rates and from a focus on the balance of payments to a sense that, you may remember the Burns doctrine, that the balance of payments didn't matter. So people were less focused on the idea that we should support exporters. But nonetheless, I think the Pergau experience really crystallized for people the damage that this linkage had done. And it turned up first in the Labour Party foreign policy statement in 1997, A Fresh Start for Britain, that they would reverse this link, which of course they had introduced. ATP was introduced by a Labour government, not by the Conservatives, and that they would reverse this if they were elected, and they did. And of course they then passed it into the 2002 Act, which makes it illegal to use aid resources for any purpose other than poverty reduction. And I think that legacy of Pergau Dam, the 2002 Act, has really marked a huge change. I was at the PAC yesterday, as it happens, and they were grilling the permanent secretary about the newspaper reports that British companies had been making profits from the aid programme. And what kind of a scandal was this, that aid was being diverted in this way to support British companies? And I was reflecting then how different that conversation was today than it would have been at the time of the Pergau Dam Affair. It was a really very interesting comparison. So that's been a hugely important legacy. And I think it remains relevant today that we remember the lesson of Pergau, because there are people today who want to use the aid budget not only to reduce poverty but for these broader economic affairs, and we should not forget the lesson of what happened when we did that. The third point I want to make is about the institutional structure of government. And what is very clear in your book is how damaging it was that ODA was a subsidiary of the Foreign Office. I had forgotten until reading the book that everything that went to number 10 from ODA had to go through the Foreign Secretary's office. I remember it now. Now that you mentioned it in the book, I remember it. But of course, this was very debilitating. You had Chris Patton and Linda Chalker absolutely clear that this was a mistake. You had you and officials here in the room very clear that it was a mistake, unable to articulate that case in government. Why? Because you had a foreign secretary who was, partly because he was indifferent to the aid programme, but also because he was busy. When he had what he regarded as his primary function was managing foreign policy. And he never had time to think about whether this was a good aid policy. And he ended up approving it on the basis that, we should stick to a deal made by Margaret Thatcher. And there was no real opportunity for ODA to have a voice in government and explain why this was a bad idea and see it off. And we're very lucky in the UK now to have a separate government department responsible for international development, represented by a cabinet minister. It's unusual in the world. It was a direct consequence, again, of the Pergau Dam Affair. I spoke to the person recently who drafted the Labour Party policy statement in 1996, that this is what they were going to do. And it was directly because of Pergau Dam that they made that commitment in the manifesto. And those of you who read Claire Short's autobiography will recall that moment where, as he became Prime Minister, Tony Blair was advised by his Foreign Affairs advisor and by the Foreign Office to reverse this decision, right? And he apparently offered her the job of aid minister, but not as a separate government department. And John Vereker then advised her to resist, and she said on that basis she wouldn't take the job. And so we ended up with a separate government department. But the story of your book, I think, is that if we want these development interests to be properly articulated in government, we have to have a cabinet minister and a separate government department. And I've been recently flirting with the idea that there might be a case for reintegrating DFID into the Foreign Office. As aid becomes less important, as we think more about other aspects of our policy to promote development objectives, you can see the value of having development in a more powerful foreign ministry. But reading your book reminded me why that would be actually a stupid idea. And so I was grateful to you for that reminder. So those are my 3 points.
Excellent, yes. Very, very good points. There are lots of other really interesting points in Tim's book about relation to ministers and civil servants. I think about the interlinkage of civil service and business interests. Some very interesting things about the way number 10 operated in that late Thatcher. So I was just reminiscing with Tim. Sitting in the Treasury, we used to get the letter from the MOD or the Foreign Office asking for some item of expenditure that the Treasury was bound to resist, and simultaneously we get the reply from Charles Powell agreeing to it before the Treasury had a chance to say anything, which was one of the sort of facts of life we accepted, and then we had to decide whether we were going to try and have a pointless row anyway. And look at
which is exactly what happened with Pergau. The letter came back within 12 hours before the Treasury had a chance to comment.
Yes, things seem to get lost in the
on a
post
Saturday.
of the Treasury as far as I can see. But anyway.
Is someone here going to put Mrs. Thatcher's point of view?
Is anyone here? Well, Andrew Turnbull. Looking at Andrew Turnbull, who is in the audience, who must have been Principal Private Secretary for some of this. Number 10. Andrew, wait till we get a microphone through. We've got Kerry. Lord Turnbull. Andrew, yeah, behind you. Very complicated. Just.
Well, on the specific incident of the Saturday morning, I think it was a stitch-up that Charles came in on a Saturday morning when most of us didn't, with families to look after, and he got his reply out before anyone else else received it. More generally, supposing we had legislation which said it was legal to attach aid, and an ATP could be attached to the aid budget. But even and had the Pergau Dam actually been thought of at the time as a good project, it was an extraordinarily bad value in terms of creating GDP and jobs. So that aspect of it was slightly kind of underplayed in the book, I thought. But we worked out that there were about 4 companies that got the lion's share of this money. One of them, GC, mysteriously just disappeared off the face of the earth. But as a way of adding productive value added to the economy, it was extraordinarily inefficient.
And did Mrs. Thatcher ever recognise that? I mean, I know in the Treasury we sometimes thought, should we actually just list export credit or ATP by company rather than by country, which we tended to do.
Well, I think I answer. She knew which companies were getting it. It was Balfour Beatty, GEC, Bywater,
Aerospace.
And British Aerospace. They wouldn't have been getting ATP. So she knew about the companies, but she didn't know about the economics. No, she didn't know about the economics. I mean, she wouldn't have read an article by John Toy, which damned ATP, and the economics of it. She was interested in economics, as I know. I think arranged seminars for it, economics, but she was interested in macroeconomics. She wasn't interested in microeconomics. So this just
Sam is absolutely right that the geopolitics of this dominated it. Yeah. For some reason, she had decided that she wanted to form, as best she could, and it was very difficult, an alliance with Mahathir, all the way through the Commonwealth. And I don't know, you may have gone to the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in Kuala Lumpur in '89, entirely dominated by the South African issue. And she was asked at that, there are 49 members of the Commonwealth, and 48 of them think you're not being tough enough in South Africa. What do you think? She says, I feel sorry for the other 48. And I think she thought that somehow or other that Mahathir was the leader of that difficult Commonwealth, and so she didn't want to antagonise him further, and this was, I think, a way of trying to placate him.
But can I just pick up on that? I mean, that is not a totally unreasonable approach for her to take. She's looking at the big picture. There's astonishing machismo attaches to these wretched arms deals. I mean, politicians slowly around the world boasting arms deals. It's a symbol of their potency. It's quite extraordinary. But they are obsessed with them, and they take precedence of almost any other trade activities, selling weapons. But at the time, it wasn't a completely absurd thing to want to be nice to this particular country. She was actually getting a pretty good deal. I mean, she did care about arms manufacturers in Britain. It's an unreasonable thing to be. And here she's dealing with these insufferable civil servants who get in her way all the time. They're endlessly going to behind her back to the Treasury and the Public Accounts Committee, and they're citing one regulation after another. We're having it at the same time now. Why can't we just get on with running the country? And I hope someone was here, who was there at the time, who said, look, Lankester's a great guy, but God, he was a nuisance.
Yeah. He did.
He's an enemy of enterprise, but anyway, to use a more recent phrase. More questions or comments? Because I know we've got lots and lots of people. Come here first.
I'm moving away from aid more to the question about the relationship between ministers, civil servants, and evidence, on which we've had a number of talks here recently, and what we should do about it. The DWP, Department for Work and Pensions, recently commissioned or actually undertook an impact analysis, a cost-benefit analysis effectively, they didn't do the cost-benefit, an impact analysis of something called mandatory work activity, which concluded, and we know, I'm Jonathan Portis, the Director of the National Institute of Economic and Social Research. We reviewed this impact analysis, which concluded, quote, the key conclusions are that mandatory work activity had a small and transitory impact on benefit receipt and no impact on employment. So basically a program which did nothing at all. On the same day that the department published this impact assessment, but a few hours earlier, the Secretary of State the Minister issued a press release which said, "I am pleased to announce that the government has decided to expand the mandatory work activity scheme. This decision has been taken as a result of the careful consideration of the positive impacts demonstrated within the impact assessment." So now this, of course, is not several hundred million, maybe a 10 million or something, so it's a bit smaller. But a couple of obvious questions are, first of all, this does give you some pause, unfortunately, about transparency, because this was all completely public. And frankly, the only people who shouted about it were the same people who think mandatory work activity is a terrible idea anyway on ideological grounds because it's work there, not because they think it's a waste of money. That's the first point. The second point is, of course, this sort of thing happens all the time. And what should civil servants do about it? Should Robert Devereux at DWP have asked for a direction? It's quite difficult from his point of view. Again, this is, a few million, doesn't even reach his desk, and he has clearly a relationship with the Secretary of State that he has to preserve. So the incentives on him to actually do something about it are not very strong. And I can understand his position.
Well, I don't know the case. I'll make one comment. I mean, I think it's much more difficult for civil servants today because relations between civil servants and ministers are so poor. In the case of with me, my relationship with Douglas Hurd was not affected adversely. He called me in, and we had a chat, and he said, "You did your job, I did mine." And George Younger, who was slightly asleep on the job, he never publicly criticised his advisors, which he could have done, I think. Now, that wouldn't happen today. So I'm slightly sympathetic with Devereux. On the other hand, if it is as bad as you say, I'd have thought maybe there would be a case for asking for a written instruction.
Okay, let's have some more comments from the audience. Got one down the front here. And then we'll go to the back. So if you could just tell us who you are as well.
My name's Ben Jackson. I'm Chief Executive of an organisation called Bond that brings together development agencies. More relevantly, as Tim knows, I was head of campaigns of the World Development Movement at the time of the Pergau Dam. And I wondered if I could just share one or two kind of contributions on the point about lessons. First of all, to say, as Tim knows, I think this is fantastic. He's written this book and documenting both what I think is interesting about the affair itself, but also the long kind of context for that in terms of policy, which I think is the thing I wanted to just quickly touch on. I mean, I also get called upon occasionally, which makes me feel very old, to sort of talk to kind of young campaigners about lessons, and that's what I really wanted to reflect from in terms of this, because I think two or three things. One of it is the real kind of the kind of link between strategy and objectives and tactics, and it was a pretty big decision for a small organisation based in a pretty drafty office down in Brixton to commit to legal kind of action. Even the first action, which was to establish that we could take a case. I learnt all this, but I think the reason that we did it was exactly the same reasons that Tim points to in the book, which is reassuring, I think. Which was that we had long campaigned, along with others, against the aid trade provision because of the way it commercialised the aid programme, and also, for the same reason Simon talks about, arms sales. But I think the reason we chose at that point to enter into the legal frame was because we saw this as an opportunity. You can make the arguments, you can make the case, you can make all the moral cases you like. There comes a point, and it's a very difficult point to take, and it is like, campaigning is a battle, and at what point do you kind of grab the initiatives? And this was the point, and I think it proved right in the end. We of course didn't think we were going to win, but that was a nice added extra. And a couple of other points quickly was... You
didn't think you were going to win? I thought you thought 60-40 you would win.
Well, I think when we went to the kind of first stage about locus, which was about our right to take the case, which was really to make the case, then we kind of thought, well, it's worth a go, and it doesn't cost us much, and we got some nice lawyers who kind of help us out. When we did that, we thought, wow, maybe we should do this. Anyway, and I think the other quick thing in terms of lessons from a campaigner's point of view in this is the point about unexpected allies, and it's always the point I make to other campaigners, is those, and I think this is the interesting point, there are often those, people see themselves as, we are campaigners, we are against government. And of course, as Tim illustrates extremely well in the book, often you are allies with different parts of government, and that is the smart way to think. And that people who say, well, you're taking the government to court, we say, well, we're taking the government to court, but obviously our primary witness is also the government in the shape of Tim and others in the department, because without him taking that stance, we wouldn't have been able to do that. I think that was the critical point that opened the door. But, you know, it does take courage. It took courage by Tim to stand up, but it also did take courage for an organisation like ours to put this significant financial risk. And I do remember a very hot, well, sweaty anyway, Saturday with the board down there thinking over this issue as to whether it was the right thing. And I think the final thing I want to say is what I think is interesting about the affair is the way in which, for all the messiness, from a kind of campaigner's point of view, it's kind of interesting because you have all the different kind of, pretty much all the kind of levers that you could use were entering the fray. So you had the select committees, and there were 3 select committee inquiries, you didn't forget, including the PAC and the NAC and all that stuff. So that was interesting, and we gave evidence to that. One of the most alarming experiences in my life when appearing before that select committee. But also kind of public campaigning and the media doing their job eventually, and also you know, ordinary people writing letters and doing things. And so, although it was messy actually in reality, and it went from one to the other, in another way, it kind of, you know, I think it's a hopeful thing because it showed the ways in which people inside and outside government. You know, I never walked into Tim's office, or I'm sure you wouldn't have seen me, but you know, and said that. But there was an alliance that we had. I mean, there were a few phone calls that I had, not with Tim, but others, but all very proper and so on. But I think that's what's interesting, is that right, good people can, by working together in a kind of informal alliance, make things change. So I thought it was useful to kind of contribute that.
Tim, just one point on the legal case. Why didn't you appeal? Because if this is this landmark judgment that seems to expand the
Well, are there any government legal advisors here tonight? The answer is that there was a view that Douglas Hurd should appeal, but he'd had enough. He took the view that if he lost the appeal, he would be finished. I mean, he thought of resigning anyway after the decision went against him, but when he realised that there was a chance that he would lose the appeal. But people like Derry Irvine, who wrote an article in Public Law in 1996, was very disappointed that he didn't appeal, because Derry Irvine and other leading lawyers thought that this was a bad decision, and that the courts had gone. Judicial activism had moved too far.
At the back.
William Keegan. One comment and one question. Fantastically interesting, and clearly an extraordinarily bad investment economically. But also, I'm not sure that subsequent behaviour of Mahathir was very good in diplomatic relations or foreign policy either. But my question is, you mentioned John Lippett. I don't know if he's here. I remember John Lippett as being a very powerful and forceful civil servant at the DTI, I think. And didn't he go straight to GEC? Can you tell me more about the lobbying role?
Can I? Well, in my first 2 weeks at ODA, he took me out to lunch to Hilton Hotel and said, "We expect good things from you, my boy," because I knew him. I knew Lippett from my Treasury days. As a youngster in the Treasury, I'd worked with him. He was a very vigorous, effective DTI Under-Secretary. He was sort of entrepreneurial civil servant whom Mrs. Thatcher would have really enjoyed having around her. So then he shifted to GEC, and he used the same sort of vigour, if you like. Yeah, he knew everybody in Whitehall. He had access to number 10, and well, he was vigorous. I wouldn't. He was certainly somebody who you couldn't, who you had to take into account. And I wouldn't say he was feared, but he was a serious irritant to those of us who wanted to do the right thing.
Simon, I just wondered if you had any views on it, because it's one of the themes, these sort of interconnections, and the Colin Chandler position, which being paid for to run the Defence Export Sales Organisation, very selfless of BAE, and then there's sort of Charles Powell migrating onto Trafalgar House, who he clearly had a relationship with. And I just wondered if you had any sort of views on whether this is, this was then and now is different.
Well, I was interested, actually. I asked him whether Tim felt he was the last of a grand old breed of people who played such a prominent role in a row like this, and then was able to write a book about it, which is it's a distinguished and brave thing to do. If I look at recent rows, not the same, but same sort of things like the Great Planning Row, the row of the aircraft carriers, the row of HS2. I mean, these things that seethe around Whitehall at the moment. You very rarely encounter permanent secretaries standing up for anything. The people you go to, I don't think they're not present here, but the people you go to are the lobbyists. I mean, now it's the big interest groups, it's the lobbies, it's the pressure groups, it's the representatives of firms who go straight to ministers and special advisors. And the chemistry of these decisions is quite different from what it was then. I mean, is that?
Well, I mean, this is 20 years ago, so I wouldn't, writing the book now is not that brave. It's not 30 years, but it's 20 years, isn't it, since this all happened. I couldn't have written the book if Mark Locott hadn't opened the files to me. He didn't have to open the files, but he did. And I read 100 files and found a lot of material I'd never seen before. So, we in ODA and former colleagues here, my deputy Bob Ainscough, Barry Arson, we did not go out and lobby against this decision. We played it absolutely correctly. Wouldn't you agree, gentlemen? We did. We did the right stuff. I never met Ben Jackson in my life. We just didn't have those. We played it by the book, and the whole thing was kept under wraps until even though we were pretty upset about the whole thing, but it was kept under wraps until the National Audit Office reported 2.5 years later.
Okay, we've got a number of questions, so let's just take some back.
This is Barry Arton, who's the Principal Finance Officer.
Barry trying to get in. Yeah, we'll go there and then
Hello. A very quick question here, and thank you for that. Richard Murray from the Africa Governance Initiative. I'm just wondering what lessons there are from the book, Tim, perhaps, from the Malaysian perspective for the developing countries, and sort of thinking about the contemporary situation, perhaps not with an arms deal, perhaps an agribusiness deal, and not necessarily a British side of that half, but maybe a Chinese one, whether there are lessons on ensuring value for money in what you want from development.
Okay, let's hold that and let's go to John and then Barry. John, former head of public spending in the Treasury for many years.
Yes, well, I know we're on the side of the angels, quite like Tim and Aid was, I'm afraid. And obviously this had a tremendously salutary effect on Aid, which has gone from strength to strength and differed ever since. I wanted to pick up two other points, comments you made. One was you said, well, George Younger had done the deal and he was out selling arms and that was his job. That always struck me as a very odd, not inevitable that a defence secretary should be a salesman. I wonder if you think the Pergau Dam, or if you know whether it had any impact on the MOD's behaviour in relation to arms sales. So that was one point. The other was more about your role as accounting officer. I'm not sure, you say, well, it was very rare for accounting officers to seek direction then. I think it's very rare now. And actually it's a very difficult thing to do because you say you've got these three criteria: efficiency, economy and effectiveness. But those are, in most government programs, very, very arguable. And what you actually mean, I mean, you have to be so far below the line to be confident. I just wonder whether actually you'd favour giving permanent secretaries or principal finance officers or whatever some rather firmer statutory basis for applying a value for money criterion.
Okay, and we'll come to Barry.
Thank you, Barry Arson. Tim, as it fell to me at the time, I think to advise you wrongly, as it turned out, on the matter of law, and it was me who didn't take legal advice in advising you, which I've always regretted, though I do think that had we done so, we'd have probably not got the answer that we would have expected. Or not that we expected, sorry, that the High Court.
Yeah. We would have got the answer that it was lawful, I think we
would, yes. And it's interesting that Irvin later came to the view in his learned publication that had we appealed, we'd probably won. But as is always the case in these matters, ministers, or indeed anybody, does not wish to give more oxygen to the affair than is necessary. And whether we'd won or not, ministers were not interested in taking an appeal. The other two quick points I'd make is, interestingly, the DTI has not got much really a great deal of publication in this. And of course it was they that originally supported so strongly Pergau. But ironically, at the last minute, they changed their minds and said gas turbines were much better than what they term muck raking, in the Pergau context. My only final point is, while I agree very much with what Owen has otherwise said, I think Pergau was hugely important in the whole of the aid history. I don't think that it itself was instrumental in the Labour government returning us to cabinet rank. I think that was an inevitable political decision, quite independently of Pergau. Thanks.
Okay. Tim, do you want to pick up those questions?
First, Malaysia. Well, I don't want to preach to Malaysia. And we never did, actually, although we were accused by various politicians, Lord David Young and Alan Clark, of being arrogant and telling the Malaysians what to do. We never told the Malaysians what to do. If they wanted to build Pergau themselves, they could have done so. They didn't need our money, but they wanted our subsidy. But even now, I wouldn't really want to tell them what to do, because they've been an incredibly successful economy. I mean, their per capita income has grown by 4 to 5% over the last 30 years, and done quite so well recently. But having said that, they probably could have done better. They've wasted money on some white elephant projects in the industrial sector, and conflict of interest has been a serious problem for the last 30 years. So, hopefully, if anybody reads this book in Malaysia, they would ask questions about why do we have such large projects. But I'm not very familiar with the government of Malaysia today. They've got some elections coming up next year. We'll see what happens. There's a possibility that Anwar will win. But certainly under Mahathir, he wouldn't have been interested in this book. He wasn't interested in economics. He was secondly, did this have any effect on MOD? I don't think it did. I think it was water off a duck's back, actually. I don't think it had any effect at all, but I may be wrong. John gave... mine was an easy one, John. I mean, this was so outrageous. This was so outrageously bad. You couldn't, if you looked at this, this was so far away from being economic or efficient that you didn't have to say, well, yes or no. I mean, the only thing which affected me was, is this going to cause, is it too late, actually? I mean, I was criticised by Richard Needham, who said, why didn't you tell us this a year ago? Then we might have taken some notice. And the last point, DTI, yes. DTI did change at the last minute. Peter Lilly was the new Secretary of State. He didn't believe in industrial subsidies. And Dick Jones took the DTI to Malaysia, and you persuaded them that gas technology was better for industry than cement.
Owen, do you want to come in on any?
Just something on this question of should permanent secretaries have a framework for making value for money decisions. I think it's tempting to think of us as civil servants kind of guarding the public purse, but it does seem to me that transparency and getting this kind of information out is probably going in the long run to be a more effective way of constraining government. Now, Jonathan Porto's made the excellent point earlier that you can have information on the record and still ministers can make stupid decisions. But at least they then have to defend those decisions. It raises the political cost to governments of making the wrong choices. And if this had happened today, Alan and Dick's analysis would be in the public domain. It would be published through the FID. And that concentrates the mind of officials and ministers, knowing that when they sign off on any project, all that information will be available immediately. It doesn't completely guarantee you but it makes it much, much harder. And that seems to be a much more likely route to constraining poor decisions than trying to give a statutory basis to permanent secretaries.
No, actually, I think it's a rather important point. I'm fascinated by the movement from government, classically, politicians come in and they negotiate with the administration, the civil service. And the civil service represents continuity, sanity, good government. Politicians represent charisma, craziness, elections, but sort of driving things forward. And it was sort of creative tension. And I think this book wonderfully illustrates, possibly, and I was asking the question before, I didn't quite answer it, whether this was the last of the old era before the new era came in. Now I'm fascinated by government by U-turn, where you effectively splurge something out. It's chaos. Everybody tips in, documents are summoned, people appear on television. 3 months later, 6 months later, 9 months later, you've got a completely different policy. Probably a better one. Maybe a better one than you would have had under the old system. I just don't know. Only time will tell. French Revolution. But it is different. And the thing I worry about losing, and it comes through very clearly in what Tim's saying, is the sense that there was, in the British public realm, a corps d'élite, a body of people who felt very strongly that certain standards had to be maintained, that continuity was important, that politicians had to be kept under some sort of control, and that, I think, has gone.
Interesting.
Got some more comments now. Come to the front. Harry?
Adam Raphael.
Yeah, Adam Raphael. Adam?
The word transparency has been bandied around here quite a lot, and I'm not sure my definition of transparency isn't probably rather different from many of the civil servants here in this room. Old men forget, but when I was on the Observer, I wrote about Pergau, and I wrote about that it was linked to arms, and I think that was in 1989, a long time before the NAO. So, of course, one way of achieving transparency, which I'm sure most of the people in this room would not necessarily approve, would be to brief journalists, and things come to a head quite quickly. Now, it shows the ineffectiveness of my stuff, both on the Saudi Arabian arms deal, again, which I knew about, and huge bribes were being paid, and indeed the stuff on Malaysia, where I said Mrs. Thatcher had acted illegally, and that very little attention was paid to it. So yes, transparency is important, and it can be achieved in different ways, but I suppose I make a small plea. I think alerting journalists and making sure they're briefed properly is not a bad way.
The ODA SPADs would have leaked it, surely, wouldn't they?
I suppose my question to Tim, really, on this is, do you think journalists were helpful to you or not in this respect, or did they just cause you more trouble?
Okay, let's go here.
Most of the very interesting...
Can you tell us who you are?
Sorry, Michael Lipton, University of Sussex. Most of the very interesting attempts to generalise from this evidence have been about the aid programme. I wonder if there are general lessons about a specific ministry, the Ministry of Defence, the way that it conducts itself within government and the way it conducts itself vis-à-vis the arms industry. It seems to me quite special, quite different from any other ministry or any other ministry to sector relationship. As has been mentioned several times, the Myanmar business has echoes of it outside the aid programme, and I would argue that the Kinetic affair, which was completely transparent, completely legal, everybody knew it was going on, and it was ultimate, to me, the even greater scandal than Pergau, and remains so. Is there something about defence and the relationship between defence and the industries providing for defence and the government, which is special, and is so why?
Okay, well, let's just go along to the end there.
Humphrey Hawksley. I was at the Mahathir's press briefing, fairly chaotic press briefing, on the I'm Not So Cheap saga that the Sunday Times did. He was quite brilliant at it, but during that, Anwar came up to me and he said, how do you think he's doing?
Which year was that?
About 93, 94.
Okay.
You mentioned it
after they break, after he
Yes, after that.
Yeah.
And, the and he said, how do you think he's doing? And I said, doing all right. And then I followed him out, and I said, what did you mean by that? And he said to me, I've been told that it might be the right time to make a move. Now, we all know that Anwar made a move a little too early, and the consequences. And I think my question is, were you dealing with him at all on this, or was there any sort of communication?
None whatever. We had I had no connection with the Malaysian government at all. In fact, we were criticised for not connecting with the Malaysian government. This whole thing was done with the National Power Company. We knew, our High Commissioner in Malaysia was reporting on the views of the Malaysian government, but ODA did not have direct connection.
You didn't have any development specialists in the High Commission
or
a regional office?
No, Alan Whitworth. Let's not go too much detail, but under the ATP program, it was a much lighter touch appraisal. Alan Whitworth visited, and Dick Jones visited, and one of your colleagues, but it wasn't much going on in that.
So let's come to this question about the role of journalists.
Yes, can I have a go?
Help or hindrance, or?
Well, help really, but it was all, we were sort of ambiguous. I mean, we weren't supposed to go and have lunch with Adam Raphael because, I don't know how to answer that question. I mean, yes, if you felt, but I knew that this was such a huge thing that it wasn't something you could go and talk to journalists about.
And your ministers, I mean, either Chris Patton or Linda Chalk.
They didn't. But let me just say this. I mean, Adam Raphael wrote brilliantly throughout. Adam was, I think, the first journalist who picked this up in 1989. And but what I think the civil service were wrong in doing is helping ministers be obscure in the answers they gave to parliamentary questions. And I'll give you an example of this, which I quote. Joan Lester, MP, she was the Labour spokesman overseas aid, which I suspect she picked this up from Adam. She asked the Defence Secretary whether there was any reference to civil aid in any of the correspondence in 1988 between the two governments on arms sales. We know there was. This is the answer. All dealings between the two governments on the proposed sale of arms was formalised in a memorandum of understanding. No mention is made in that document of overseas aid to Malaysia. I mean, this is a classic non-answer. And whoever wrote that answer for the MOD, it's really bad. I would feel so ashamed to be in that. But that is what happens. It happens to this day. Civil servants are trying to help ministers not tell lies, but so,
Some people shuffling sheepishly there.
Can I just pick up a point here, slightly off topic from the kind of development thing, but this question of what the role of civil servants is in policing government, I think, is really interesting. I am very uncomfortable with the idea that it's the job of civil servants to leak things to journalists. It seems to me that it's for the public and Parliament to hold ministers to account, not the civil service. And I think we get into a very dangerous situation when we say that civil servants should be policing the system. The problem comes if civil servants are aware that there's information within the system that Parliament and the public don't have access to exercise that accountability. And it seems to me what we should be looking for is mechanisms to ensure that that doesn't happen, to make sure that we have systems that ensure that all this, as much information as possible is available so that that accountability can take place. But I think it goes beyond the job of the civil servant to say that we are responsible for policing it by, for example, leaking things to journalists. And I certainly think that breaches the code of what it is to be a civil servant.
Simon, do you want to come in on this point about MOD and the sort of culture of MOD and arms sales? I mean, I think John made the point about, was it obvious that the Ministry of Defence was also the champion sponsor and arms salesperson in chief?
Well, I think it's very well put. I mean, but it's a completely separate phenomenon. The MOD and the defence industry and the armed services. They're unlike anything else in Britain, apart from the Church of England, possibly. I mean, they're a world entirely unto themselves. They are, in my view, totally corrupt. It's built on the theory that this activity, spending huge amounts of money on defence, defends you. Yeah. It doesn't. It's unnecessary. The threats have to be concocted by brilliant people from Oxford. It's all rubbish. I mean, I put the MOD inside the Foreign Office, and then you get some sanity. But it's so powerful, it's so extravagant, it's so all-pervasive. Every minister goes weak at the knees, the uniform comes into the room. It's really pernicious, and I think we just see a glimpse of it here. I mean, you see what it's done to America, where it's just rampant, but it's pretty bad here.
Okay, we've got time probably for 3 more questions. So very quickly, we'll just go to the back of the room. There.
Michael Patterson.
Yeah.
Yeah, Mike Patterson.
Two questions, one generic and one specific. The generic one is listening to all this, and I've been out of the area of government for several decades now, but I follow the noises in the system about giving ministers much greater hire and fire powers over permanent secretaries, and I wonder how that discussion fits into what we've heard this morning. On the specifics, I haven't read Tim's book yet, but I wonder whether Tim has thought about or believes that Charles Pole was privy to the original arrangement that George Younger took with him to Malaysia.
Okay, let's come forward, yes.
Yeah, Francis Beddington, formerly of ODA, and worked on the NAO report. I would thought was interesting, it was the international context at the time. Aid was all done by all countries, and that was gradually stepped back with things like the Helsinki Agreement. Do you think the Pergau Dam specific itself helped with that, of getting all aid untied, sort of globally?
Okay, and I think there's 1 or 2 last questions. Yeah. There and then there. So,
who's first?
Yeah, you further back. No, you've both got microphones, it's fine.
Yes, I was involved marginally in the Pergau, but heavily in the rest of the ODA operation at the time. Now, the interesting thing is whether the reasons why Pergau came to be the celebrated case it was the defence link and the personality of the Prime Minister. The background, of course, is that for a long time, the British aid programme leaned towards supporting British commercial interests. A great deal of British aid was tied, which itself draws aid to commercial interests. And then the ATP was introduced, as somebody said, by the Labour government at the time. So this has been endemic. And this distorted the way aid was used for a great deal of the years that the aid program was run, up to the toxic explosion that came from Pergau. And I do think that did change things. But I recollect being cross-examined in the DAC when most donors were aware of Pergau and the position that the ODA had taken. What happened there was not a feeling that we'd demonstrated how disgraceful British aid was, but how terrific it was that the British system could expose it. Because all those people representing aid agencies in other countries well knew that this was happening pretty systematically in their own systems. So they thought we were pretty good at this.
And the final question.
Okay. I'm Peter Owen. I had responsibility for appraising most ATP cases in the mid-80s and from the economic perspective. And
I've seen from Smiley's people.
Yes. And I have to say they were a rather mixed bunch, and in those days the technocratic arguments prevailed. But what I wanted to make a different point really was that this experience illustrated to me the sad lack of thinking about industrial policy in the UK, because we used to confront people who were adamant that certain cases were vital to British commercial interests, and they didn't seem to stand up at all. In fact, most of them were not going to create very much employment, and most of them were not in markets of any particular importance to the UK. So it was a mystery to me how there was such a head of steam behind this. But it wasn't really my job to look at that. It was bad enough trying to assess the developmental case, which we usually had to do under great time pressure.
Okay, well, so we've got some questions there about the sort of aid tying and Mike Patterson's separate one. Because, of course, Tim, you were, I'm not sure you've heard of promotion, but you were was not a career-ending move for you, because you went on to be Permanent Secretary at the Department for Education.
Yeah, that was a career-ending move. Definitely, yeah, but no,
well.
Yeah. So I see. Well, Michael Patterson, should ministers fire permanent secretaries? I don't think so. No, they should take. I mean, one thing I don't like. I'm not very close to it now, but the thing I don't like is when today's ministers publicly blame their officials. In my day, in the 80s, that did not happen. Howe, and I worked with a whole bunch of them, Lawson and Howe, they didn't do that. They took responsibility. They did not publicly blame mistakes that were made, and I think that was right, and that is a bad change. I don't know whether Charles Powell knew about it in advance. I don't know. Read my book and you'll see there's a section on that. Yeah. And I think Bob Ensko has answered the question about did Pergau have an impact on other aid donors. I found that very interesting.
I was wondering, at the moment we're told that every government department is being asked to justify everything it does in terms of its contribution to growth. I just wondered, Owen, whether you saw any potential sort of risks that we might be looking through aid through a sort of slightly different lens, particularly maybe with a slightly more sceptical Secretary of State than we were before.
It's not clear that we have a more sceptical Secretary of State, but it is certainly the case that this government, and actually not just this government, the governments do want to defend the aid programme, partly on the basis that it's in Britain's strategic commercial interests to build relationships. And there is a slippery slope from there to saying that we can and should use the aid programme to not only to reduce poverty, but also somehow to promote the interests of British firms. I think we are very well protected by the existing legislation. The 2002 Act famously was used by Clare Short to see off an attempt by Number 10 to use the aid programme to tackle a perceived problem of asylum seekers. Number 10 took it into their heads that we would give more aid to countries that took back asylum seekers. And Clare Short popped up on Newsnight and announced that this would be illegal under the Act. And that was the end of that idea. So I think we're well protected by the Act, but also I think by memory of the experience of what actually happened when we did use the aid programme in this way. It is just very difficult to manage a programme that has these, if you did try and manage two objectives, what we saw with ATP, and I think we would see again, is that the economic objective would dominate. But I think one of the things that happened at during the 1980s was a realignment in government in which the Treasury and ODA and Ben Diffid took on the mercantilism of the DTI, the Foreign Office, and the Ministry of Defence, and formed an axis which was much stronger than, which I think served Diffid extremely well through the 1980s and the 1990s and since, that these were government departments that understood that there is no economic value in subsidising exporters to do uneconomic things, and that's a waste of public money as well as a waste of the aid budget, and that it should stop. And I think that axis is extremely important, and I worry that Diffid's focus today on reaching 0.7%, which causes some friction with the Treasury, undermines that basic common interest that the Treasury and Diffid have to do the right thing across government rather than to do the wrong thing, which I'm afraid the mercantilism still exists in the MOD, the DTI, and the Foreign Office. On the question of untying aid, my perception is that other countries moved quicker than Britain in untying aid. Although we now have legislation that protects us from tied aid, I don't think that we led the world in untying. I think we, if anything, rather lagged it, or certainly were at about the centre of the pack. Perhaps Bob or Richard Manning, both of whom are here, has a clearer recollection of that. But I don't think this drove the untying movement internationally.
Partly for for a debate outside. Simon, any final reflections on where we are now?
I don't think so. And I rather like the last comment at the back saying this all stands to our credit, or that we're discussing it in a sense. I mean, if you look at one of the great mistakes, which was the first 6 months of the Americans in Iraq, there's now a whole shelf of books on it, and just copious literature on it. I mean, the amount of talent directed to analysing the mistake compared to the amount of talent that went into the mistake, out of all proportion. One of the geniuses of America, and I hope it doesn't happen here, that people are much brighter criticising government than they are in government. But my last plea is, I think actually, particularly we're sitting in the Institute of Government, is that there is a tendency for intellectuals of government to think that it's about process. It just isn't. It's about personality. It's about the way in which these people mix and shift and fight and befriend each other. And what comes through this saga so strongly is that what mattered wasn't the rights and wrongs of it. It was the relationship between the individuals. And it's a very difficult subject to study, but it doesn't get studied enough.
Okay, well, it's a salutary end note. If you want to read more about how all these individuals come together, then Tim's book is for sale outside. But I know sometimes you come to a book launch, you feel sort of obliged to buy the book, but Tim has exempted you all from that.
Yes.
On the grounds, even with the 25% discount, it's still £60, and that does work out at
50p a page.
So, but I do recommend it. So when it is in paperback, or ask your library to get it.
Yeah, ask your library to get it.
If that's appropriate in this era of austerity.
Yeah.
So without further ado, we'd like to invite you all to join us for drinks outside. We'd like to thank the Centre for Global Development for entertaining us to drinks outside. And I'd like to thank all our speakers, Simon Jenkins, Owen Barder, and in particular Sir Tim Lankester, for giving us such an excellent presentation and discussion this evening.
Thank you.